This is a very important topic to Koreans, to everyone in the Asia-Pacific region, and to the United States in these days of tremendous stress. I just want to very quickly run through some of the war plans that I know about in the course of writing the book Pacific Powder Keg that Professor Moon referred to. The story really begins actually in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, where Koreans were first found themselves caught up in the crossfire of nuclear war because roughly 50,000 Koreans died in those two nuclear strikes, and then another roughly 23,000 returned to Korea. We Americans tend to forget that, but I think it's deeply imprinted in the Korean psyche. In a sense, all Koreans are more expert on nuclear war than all our nuclear experts in the United States combined, because they've been underground zero. The next time, of course, that nuclear threat really became salient was during the war, where American nuclear threat was projected against North Korea and China, and where the Soviet nuclear threat first fell over and affected the disposition of American conventional forces assembling to counterattack, particularly in Busan, where the Navy was dispersed because of the possible threat of a Soviet nuclear attack. This is perhaps the first time that we see the nuclear shadow cast in both directions in an actual war. In the late 1950s, the United States developed a global war plan to annihilate the Soviet bloc, which included, of course, China and North Korea and Eastern Europe. And as part of that, there were targets, basically all major cities and logistical hubs in North Korea were targeted. And I have to say also Tiny Mongolia also had multiple warheads aimed at Ulaanbaatar, which I was surprised to read when that war plan was declassified. As Dr. Halperin said, in the 1970s, the United States shifted from this general approach to a much more limited and regional nuclear warfighting approach as the war plans were revised away from one gigantic cataclysmic war plan involving nuclear weapons to a whole array of options developed to respond to either a nuclear or a conventional attack on the United States or its allies, including Korea. And at the time in South Korea, there were hundreds, probably more than 1,000 nuclear weapons deployed, tactical and theater nuclear weapons deployed in and around Korea. Over 1,000 U.S. Forces Korea personnel were certified to work with nuclear weapons, which was a huge overhead cost, which distracted much of their capacity away from managing conventional war at the time. And in fact, nuclear weapons were brought into play during the 1976 crisis in August at the demilitarized zone at Panmunjom in the aftermath when the tree-cutting team was sent in, which included, of course, South Korea's current president in the backup Korean force to cut down the poplar tree. General Singlaub actually brought nuclear artillery right up to the demilitarized zone and was prepared to use them at that time. Today, the nuclear annex to the US-only war plan in Korea is actually primarily run out of Strategic Command in the United States. There's very limited staffing in US Forces Korea itself devoted to the nuclear option. It's almost completely concentrated appropriately on conventional warfare in the peninsula. And that means that the options to use nuclear weapons against North Korea are also highly constrained. Land-based missiles from the United States, as Dr. Halperin pointed out, would be a huge overkill, and politically speaking, they would have to overfly Russia. And I actually find it inconceivable that an American president is going to get on the phone to the Kremlin and say, don't worry about these missiles that look like they might hit Russia, they're going to nuke North Korea. The United States, if it didn't use ICBMs, might use submarine-launched ballistic missiles from submarines in the mid-Pacific, but that has a similar problem to the overflight of Russia, which is that from pretty much all angles of attack, you either have to overfly Japan or or if you're further south to attack North Korea, you would be aiming missiles pretty much directly at Beijing, which has, relative to even Russia, rather poor early warning systems today. So again, you'd have to get on the phone to China, to President Xi, and say, don't worry about the missiles that are heading in your direction, which it's all over Twitter. This is happening at this point. It's really not a risk to you, and these very large nuclear weapons are going to be exploding on the peninsula. I think that that's pretty much inconceivable. Technically, it is possible that you could have what's a depressed trajectory or low-angle 15-minute attack from much closer in if you were to deploy American submarines very close to the Korean Peninsula and maybe use one of the recently deployed low-yield nuclear warheads on the missiles on those submarines. I don't think that's very likely, because to do so, you then put those submarines carrying a huge complement of strategic nuclear weapons very close to the anti-submarine warfare capabilities of both China and Russia. I just don't think the United States would take that risk with its ultimate retaliatory force. So what does that leave you to deliver nuclear weapons against North Korea? It really just leaves you with the home-based or continental United States-based or forward-deployed, probably in Guam in an emergency, strategic bombers. And these have the advantage from a technical perspective that the warheads that are on the bombs that will be delivered by those bombers are dial-a-bomb. You can actually go from a very low yield, which might be appropriate to a war planner, to a very high yield, and maybe use one or two, maybe a demonstration shot. But if you think about it, to actually fight a war in Korea, which we all know, having been to Seoul many times, and some of us from the northern side of the DMZ, how close it is to Pyongyang as well as Seoul, that a war in Korea is going to be moving in seconds, minutes, hours, and days. And to get in 80 nuclear weapons with strategic bombers from the United States, it's going to be multiple flights with refueling support there and back. I mean, it's sort of like a courier service. It's going to be slow motion nuclear war relative to the speed of war fighting. It's, from a military perspective, almost completely irrelevant. Now, I think that American war planners plan for all kinds of things. That's what the military do, is they plan for wars, so they're not surprised, and that's entirely appropriate. But in reality, politicians and generals almost never fight with the war plan. And the real use of these nuclear weapons is not military. It's about psychology and coercive diplomacy and threat making. And to some extent, the threat making itself becomes the problem that could actually lead someone to go on alert with their conventional forces, and then some mistake happens, there's a loss of control, or maybe someone is probing or pushing too hard, thinking that somehow the risk of nuclear war might stop the other side responding, so I can actually be slightly more adventurous than I otherwise would be with a provocation. And the actual irony is that the nuclear threat of the kind that we saw in 2017 between the United States and North Korea is precisely what may increase the risk of nuclear war, not decrease it. So overall, I'd say that the real issue here is that threat is being used. That's what's actually in play here, not military use in an actual war plan, which will, as Dr. Halperin pointed out correctly, completely and utterly revolve around conventional forces massed at the DMZ, and then whatever each side could bring to bear on such a conflict over days and weeks of fighting in the Korean Peninsula. Luckily, we're nowhere near that at the moment, and the reason for that is very clear. The two sides have actually been talking in recent years, most obviously in the summitry, but even more important than that, and the reason that summitry has actually been possible is because of the inter-Korean military level arms control measures that have ensured that we have not had any real incidents at the demilitarized zone, with the exception of the most recent killing of the South Korean by the North Korean forces, for which Kim Jong-un then apologized. He clearly understood that this transgressed or crossed a line with South Korea that was not acceptable, and he apologized. And it's actually been that inter-Korean conventional military arrangement that created the space for the political discussions that brought down the tension, reduced the risk of nuclear war from where it had climbed because of the threats made by each side, back down to perhaps where it belongs most of the time, which is, according to the markets, roughly 0.1% per year, maybe up to 1% per year when tension is high, risk of war. And then embedded in that is a further risk of the escalation to nuclear war if someone does something really silly and loses control. So I'll stop there for the moment, Professor Moon, and be happy to circle back to more specific issues with our colleagues.